Welcome to our annual Hispanic Heritage Month event. I'm Dr. Robert Brown, Professor of History here at the college. This is our opportunity to explore the rich culture and history of Hispanics and Latinos in America, and to recognize their significant and ongoing contribution that Hispanics and Latinos make to American politics, culture, economy, and society. This is also the occasion that allows us to draw attention to some significant current issues affecting America's Hispanics and Latino communities. And this is one such occasion. I'd like to welcome Dr. Michelle Martin-Barron, Assistant Professor of Women's Studies at Hobart and William Smith College. She has a doctorate and an MA from, actually in the opposite order, from University of California, Berkeley. She's an Assistant Professor of Women's Studies there. And she teaches a fascinating assortment of courses on gender and feminism and their relation to the arts and identity formation. Her many publications include contributions to the Encyclopedia of Latina Folklore and Queer Necropolitics, which was published by Routledge in 2013. Breathlessly and without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Martin-Barron. Please welcome her. And there is an attendance roster circulating, so if you could write your name and indicate your status if you're a member of the public, let us know if you're here for a class. Also, please let us know the name of your instructor.
All right, thank you. Everyone can hear me okay? Amazing, okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, and to all of you for being here. When I was asked to come give this talk for Hispanic Heritage Month, I knew right away that I wanted to talk about Chicanas and visual culture. This is a subject that I teach on, and I find that Chicano and Latino communities have a unique and important perspective when it comes to envisioning the arts as a central part of agitating for social change and working towards social justice. And then, on September 5th, President Trump repealed the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Act, otherwise known as DACA, and I knew that I'd be speaking today about the urgent issue of immigration reform and how Chicanos and Latinos have long been at the center of national discourse around immigration. So I'm going to start today by contextualizing the DACA repeal and the xenophobic rhetoric that led to it within a larger history of Chicano and Chicana migration. However, in this presentation, I'll also be centering the arts. Do we have a clicker in this room? I just want to.
Hopefully this one works.
Okay, here we go. You know, it's fitting that we begin a talk on immigration by migrating from one room to another. Part of the performative nature of this talk. Okay, so in this presentation, I'll be centering the arts. And as my dear mentor and colleague, Laura Perez, wrote in a 2013 issue of Chikun magazine, she wrote, one of the areas today that most needs what art abounds in, creativity, artfulness, vision, is immigration policy. The arts can contribute to rethinking immigration in both the popular imagination and in legal policy in ways that reflect the increasingly open, curious, and culturally interwoven nation, continent, and globe we inhabit. The arts can also guide us towards policies crafted with greater generosity, compassion, and pragmatism. They can guide us beyond cultural Eurocentrism towards greater openness, curiosity, and dialogue with the numerous cultures of our country and globe. As I'll show you today, Chicana artists have been using the visual arts to speak back to erased histories, challenge xenophobic and racist discourse, create new visual vocabularies, and to catalyze both their own healing and the healing of their communities. So, as many of you know, this last election cycle was heavy with charged rhetoric around immigration, and in particular heightened discourse around undocumented Mexican immigrants as a threat to national security and the personal safety of U.S. citizens. Rhetorical and discourse analysis demonstrates that, quote, immigration as a security issue is a socially constructed phenomenon, end quote. And this phenomenon is one that reinforces racist and xenophobic attitudes in our country. Furthermore, studies demonstrate that despite this popular perception of migrants as criminal, and of course this is heightened by terms like illegals or illegal aliens, immigrants are statistically much less likely to commit crimes or engage in criminal behavior. However, this rhetoric of danger and criminality that saturates political and popular debates has come to shape our current policies. But this rhetoric is not new, and in fact, it's deeply historical. The story of Mexican immigration to the United States begins with a history that's largely untaught or underemphasized in conventional U.S. history educational curriculums, with the acquisition of territory from Mexico as a result of the U.S.-Mexican War, which took place between 1846 and 1848. The U.S.-Mexican War was instigated by the United States under President Polk in order to gain large amounts of land under the ideology of manifest destiny. When the war ended in 1848, Mexico was forced to cede a vast amount of its territory to the United States, areas that we now define as the landmass that contains the current states of California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Kansas, even a little bit of Oklahoma, as you can see from the map. There's the shading of all of this area, with the exception of the darkest shading right under Arizona, all was ceded as part of this treaty. The kind of hatched areas in Texas were part of a controversial annexation of Texas that happened as a precursor to the war. And as you can see, kind of American forces moved in kind of slowly towards the west until that vast amount of territory was turned over underneath the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So, although the United States, as a result of this war, had acquired the territory it desired, especially access to the Rio Grande, ports in the Gulf of Mexico, and access to the Pacific coast, the country was faced with a problem. What do you do with the vast amounts of people who are already inhabiting this land? Yeah? In order to make a case for manifest destiny and to make a case for a war with Mexico, racist rhetoric had already been circulating throughout the United States and was used to make a case for having this war. This rhetoric painted Mexicans, a mestizo people with indigenous, Spanish, and African blood, as an inferior race due to racial intermingling. Mexicans were understood by white Americans to be inferior in temperament, work ethic, intellectual capability, and civilization, all in direct denial of a rich cultural, intellectual, and material achievements of both indigenous Americans and Mexican nationals. As a result, the majority of Americans were reluctant to extend citizenship to the inhabitants of their newly acquired territory. Nevertheless, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that went into effect at the end of the war in 1848 granted all of those living on the newly Americanized land 1 year to make a decision. Either leave the lands and return to Mexico to retain their Mexican citizenship, or remain where they were and become naturalized as U.S. citizens. Doing nothing would be understood as electing to become American. This initial establishment of territory gave rise to the notion that the first Mexican Americans did not cross the border, but as the saying goes, the border crossed us. Despite the promising premise of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, white American xenophobia and racism was placated by Article 9 of the treaty, which read, and I quote, "The Mexicans shall be incorporated into the Union of the United States and be admitted at the proper time to be judged by the Congress of the United States to the enjoyment of all the rights of citizens of the United States according to the principles of the Constitution." So what's interesting about the language here is that it grants access, it grants that new citizenship would gain full representational rights given through statehood, but only when Congress deemed it appropriate. Yeah? Therefore, this allows the U.S. to wait until white settlers had amassed a majority population in the new territories, thereby effectively guaranteeing that white interests would prevail in elections and the choosing of representatives. New Mexico is a particularly telling example of how this policy played out. Despite becoming part of the United States as a result of the treaty in 1848, New Mexico, with its high population of indigenous and Mexican people, and with a slow rate of white migration, was not granted statehood until 1912, a full 64 years after the treaty went into effect, which meant that the folks who were living there did not have full representational rights underneath the Constitution as the treaty guaranteed them, right, until they were granted statehood to be able to send representatives to Congress, etc. So with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the contemporary U.S.-Mexican border was established, a man-made boundary that separated families and divided a people. Gloria Anzaldúa, in her famous book Borderlands, writes that the border es una herida abierta, an open wound where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. Borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. End quote. The border and the borderlands it creates are both psychological spaces spaces of division, conquest, and colonization, as well as a physical barrier that disrupts centuries of natural human migration. The indigenous peoples of North America, the group Anzaldúa, and identifies as the Cochise people, the forebears of the Aztecs, migrated from Aztlan, another name for the American Southwest, down to what is now Mexico and Central America, and back again numerous times over the course of human history. The Spanish conquest of 1521, as well as the later establishment of the political boundary between the US and Mexico, made such migrations impossible in the socio-political context of such definitive national borders. You'll see many Chicana artists pick up on the unnatural fact of the border in the face of natural movements of flora, fauna, and human beings as ways of drawing attention to the racism and violence that established these borders to begin with. Focusing on this element of the story of migration and immigration directly confronts the racism inherent in so many of our national conversations about immigration and immigrants. The decades immediately following the Mexican-American War were a time of only light migration. However, growing fears of white Americans in response to high levels of Asian immigrants led to the passing of two landmark immigration bills in 1882, one of which is known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it greatly curtailed the number of Asian immigrants who were allowed to come into the country. However, we have been relying on Asian immigrants for a number of projects, especially the establishment of the Transcontinental Railroad. So as a result of this curbing of immigration from Asia, U.S. employers turned south of the border for labor in agriculture, mining, transportation, and construction, again, to complete that railroad system along with other projects. The start of the Mexican Revolution in 1910 and the resulting instability within Mexico over the next few decades led to a sharp increase of Mexican migration north. By 1930, the population of folks of Mexican origin residing in the United States reached approximately 1.5 million, and that included both U.S. citizens and non-citizens. The U.S. stock market crash in the Great Depression saw a reversal of this trend, with anywhere between 350,000 to 500,000 Mexican migrants pressured or forced to leave the United States. However, the dawn of World War II quickly turned this tide back around. With vast numbers of American men fighting abroad, the U.S. faced major labor shortages, particularly in agriculture. As a result, the U.S. government, in collaboration with the Mexican government, instated the Emergency Farm Worker Agreement, which is otherwise known as the Bracero Program, in 1942, a guest worker program that allowed great numbers of Mexican laborers to travel north to the United States to work temporarily. Though this program began fairly modestly, it set the stage for increasing U.S. reliance on Mexican migrant workers in agriculture, especially as it continued to be extended well beyond the end of the war. By the time the program was terminated in 1964, over 5 million contracts had been granted. Mexican migrants were encouraged to cross without official sanctions by employers who sought to avoid red tape and bureaucracy, and for whom economic benefits far outweighed the risks of curtailing the law. The U.S. economy's reliance on both authorized and unauthorized labor from across Latin America had been firmly and indelibly established as a mainstay of the U.S. economy by 1964 and continues to operate as such, cemented by the 1994 creation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA, and the Central American Free Trade Agreement. Recognizing the dependency of the U.S. economy on Mexican and Latin American labor, and in response to the brave activism of young undocumented men and women across the United States, President Obama supported a wide-scale immigration reform bill known as the DREAM Act. When the DREAM Act failed to pass both houses of Congress in 2012, Obama issued by executive order the Deferred Plan for Childhood Arrivals, again better known as DACA. Requirements to participate were as follows. There we go. So I'll just emphasize a few of these, right? This was primarily aimed towards children who had been brought over before the age of 16, and was meant to extend them the ability to continue to get work visas to maintain legal residency in the United States. So it requires that anyone who is eligible for DACA be under the age of 31 as of June 15th of 2012, so have entered the United States by their 16th birthday, to have had continual residence in the United States, to be physically present in the U.S. at the time of requesting these accommodations, and to be currently enrolled in school or to have graduated or obtained a certificate of completion from high school, a GED, or to be a veteran of the Coast Guard or Armed Forces, and to have not been convicted of a felony, significant misdemeanor, or 3 or more misdemeanors, and to not otherwise pose a threat to national security or public safety. Yeah. So there are parts of it that talk about criminality outright that establish, right, that lawful citizens, people who have been engaged in not breaking the law, right, are those who are encouraged under DACA. A little bit, so the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services received 844,931 applications for DACA status as of June 2016. The New York Times, however, estimates there are at least 1.2 million eligible U.S. residents who could apply for DACA. Now, who are people? What does the demographic look like of folks who are eligible for DACA? Top countries of origin for DACA applicants, far above and beyond, come from Mexico, right? That's 78.5%, followed by El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras in much, much smaller numbers. And of course, there are many other countries too. These are just the top 4. While California and Texas contain the greatest number of DACA applicants, relevant to us is that New York State has the 5th largest DACA applicant population. 5.3% of the DACA applicants come from New York State. Obama also simultaneously attempted to establish what he called the Deferred Action for Parents of American and Lawful Permanent Residents, DAPA, in 2014, to give options towards legal residency of parents of minors who are either legal citizens or legal residents. But this act was blocked by the federal court in 2015 and never implemented, a decision that was upheld by the Fifth Circuit Court before going to the Supreme Court. And of course, in 2016, that hit a split decision by the Supreme Court, thereby upholding the Fifth Circuit's recommendation. Before terminating DACA, President Trump officially ended all proceedings with DAPA on the 5th anniversary of DACA's establishment. And as we all know, Trump then ended DACA on September 5th of this year. Ironically, and to the fear of many DACA recipients and applicants, the same documents that DACA applicants used to access the program could now potentially be used by Homeland Security to identify and deport those same childhood arrivals who may have not identified themselves before as undocumented, but did so in order to gain access to this federal program. So as I reviewed this history in preparation for my talk today, I was struck by the ways that history operates cyclically. Between 1942 and today, the population of U.S. Chicanos and Latinos has risen exponentially from 1.8 million in 1940 to an estimated 58 million at the end of 2016. Headlines through the last quarter of the 20th century have constantly drawn attention to this meteoric rise in the U.S. Hispanic population, fanning fears of some white Americans who worry about the same issue that plagued expansionists in 1848, the political influence of non-whites and the potential outstripping of white population by a non-white population. When I teach the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Mexican-American War, my students and I are often struck by the uncanny resemblance of discourse from the mid-1800s to the rhetoric we hear now, finding statements by government officials and reporters alike from that time that could easily have been taken from today's newspapers. Undoubtedly, the rhetoric of national security concerns, criminality of non-white and particularly Hispanic populations, and the attachment of the moniker illegal to migrants has fanned fires that led to a national climate where the repeal of DACA and discussions of building a border wall have gained traction and support up to the highest office of government. I turn back to Laura Perez's provocation as I think about these policies, and I want to ask what place the arts has in these contentious and timely debates. If our public conversation around Mexican and Latin American migration has been so damaging and misleading, how have Chicana artists used their medium to imagine new ways of communicating this history and intervening in public discourse? So for the second half of my talk, I'm going to turn to looking at art and artists. So now we've got some fun visuals, so get ready. I certainly am not the only one to think about how artists, artist interventions in the light of the repeal of DACA. When looking at the media coverage of DACA's repeal, 2 artists' works made the headlines. Camila Ontiveros' sculpture Temporary Storage, The Belongings of Juan Manuel Montes, and an installation piece at the US-Mexico border by French artist J.R. Both of these pieces debuted within days of Trump's DACA repeal, leading LA Times art critic Carolina Miranda to declare on September 20th of 2017, quote, if migration, and more specifically DACA, were to have an art moment, that moment is now. So let's look at these images that she was talking about. Temporary storage compiles the belongings of Juan Manuel Montes, who is believed to be the first DACA recipient to be deported under Trump, into a statue. Balanced precariously on 2 metal stands, Montes' belongings are bound together by knotted ropes in a looming tower that currently stands at the entrance of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Although he began working on the piece a month before Trump's decision to overturn DACA, Ontiveros sees the piece as a response to this decision, which he says he saw coming down the pipeline. As an undocumented teenager who crossed into the US, he sees himself reflected in the case of Montes. Due to a combination of having immigration papers and his success in the art world, Ontiveros was able to become a legal US resident, yet he lived with the constant fear of deportation for much of his young adult life. Temporary storage speaks to the vulnerability of migrant populations, rendering the abstract notion of over 800,000 DACA recipients into a specific story of individual human beings. When confronted with Montes' belongings, one can't help but imagine the person to whom these items belong and the loved ones left behind to somehow make sense of the stuff left when one is forcibly deported. Even more crucial is the looming absence of Montes himself, despite the presence of his belongings. Montes is both here and not here, divided by the border and its politics, which rise above the viewers in this museum space. And interestingly enough, the artist, as a graduate student, compiled his own belongings in a very similar sculpture as he was thinking about his own migration status, and remarked that it made the kind of gravity of these laws really apparent to him, and felt that this was a good time to return to this kind of experiment of compiling one's belongings in this way. Also interested in this notion of scale is French artist J.R. There we go. Who installed his larger-than-life portrait of a toddler above the border wall in Tecate, California. So you can see that image on the far right is actually a large photo that is installed up on some cement blocks, so that when you're looking at it from the US side over to the Mexico side, you see this toddler rising dozens of feet over the border wall. From the Mexican side into the US side, the toddler peers curiously, as if he's simply looking over the side of a playpen. The image emphasizes both the presence of the border fence, which many Americans don't realize exists, believing that Trump's wall proposal puts into place something that's missing, rather than building up already extant infrastructure. This image also emphasizes the absurdity of the border fence. A toddler has, quote, no idea that there's a wall that divides people, no idea of the political context, end quote. This is a statement from JR in an interview. Interested in exploring the constructed nature of borders, JR journeyed to the US-Mexico border and began working on his piece, not realizing that the DACA repeal would happen within days of completing his installation. The proximity of the decision catapulted this installation into the spotlight. Although it's been criticized for only engaging the US side of the border, not really having an equivalent experience for those on the Mexican side of the border, JR has stated that he imagines conversation and engagement in the spaces within the fence itself as people gather to take in the installation. And I don't know how well you can see that there are literally bars, right, that one could potentially see through and imagine some kind of cross-border conversation happening between people gathered on both sides. What struck me when I looked at the coverage of both of these works is not just that they are timely and address the repeal of DACA, but that they both put a personal face or narrative to the issue of the DACA repeal. They highlight the absurdity of the border and its status as a man-made barrier. These are powerful and important messages for our time. However, I was also struck by the fact that male artists, centering the subjectivities of men, or in this case, small boys, are at the heart of reporting on this art moment ushered in by the repeal of DACA. As someone who's been studying the visual cultural contribution of Chicanas, I immediately wondered where women's voices were to be found, especially since the art that highlights the border's absurdity and constructed nature are things that Chicanas have been creating art around over the last few decades, and constantly working to both challenge discourses of immigration, to highlight the construction of the border and the damage it causes to individuals, families, and communities, and to facilitate new ways of talking, as well as personal, spiritual, and communal healing, to address the wounds caused by the border and its politics. These voices, I argue, are crucial to considering the repeal of DACA not just as a hyper-contemporary art moment, but as part of a larger ongoing narrative about and with the border as a construction that indelibly shapes Chicano and Latino subjectivity both now and since 1848. And while the use of art as an activist tool has a deep and long history, I find that Chicanos and Latinos have a particularly rich history of seeing the arts not only as political tools, but as political necessities, a history that we can trace back through the Chicano movement and other early struggles for civil rights for Latinos. Like Ontiveros, visual artist Alma Lopez was born in Mexico, but raised in Los Angeles. Between 1997 and 1999, she produced a series of photo-based digital artworks entitled 1848, Chicanos in the U.S. Landscape After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This series responds to the xenophobic political climate of Los Angeles in the 1990s, recognizing the ways that this discourse harkened back to the foundational moment of the creation of the U.S.-Mexico border. Utilizing both found and created images, Lopez masterfully juxtaposes visual elements to create a narrative out of national history, personal history, and Chicano cultural icons. This image here is called California Fashion Slaves. And in it, Lopez places the skyline of Los Angeles rising out of a historic map, detailing the shifting political borders of the US and Mexico, emphasizing the way the US economy literally rests on the backs and labor of those who inhabit its borderlands. At the border between the historic map and the skyline, we see women garment workers, both historical, as evidenced by the sepia tone and old-fashioned sewing machinery, and contemporary. The full-scale image that you see in front of a woman is actually Lopez's mother. You see her sewing a star-spangled cloak on a contemporary sewing machine. Lopez is drawing upon her own personal history here. Both her mother and grandmother worked in Los Angeles' garment district. By centering the labor of women, Lopez points out the feminization of immigration began occurring in the 1970s and 80s, when women began migrating across the border in equal or greater numbers to men for the first time in history. Above the skyline, you see Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess whose fragmentation at the hand of her brother Huitzilopochtli has long operated as a symbol of the strength and fragmentation of Chicana subjectivity. And this comes from an Aztec tradition. Additionally, the universality of the moon as a natural element that exists consistently across both sides of the border emphasizes not only the constructed nature of the border itself, but the way that Chicana culture doesn't simply disappear as a result of a man-made barrier, but persists above, beyond, and despite of the follies of human beings. At the foundation of the image, we see the red numbers, 1848. I don't know how well you can see them, but they're literally right here. Yeah. So we see the numbers 1848, as well as a red arrow highlighting the discourse of manifest destiny as the origin point of xenophobic discourse about Mexican migration. Overlaying the historic map, Lopez has placed a more contemporary story, the fleeing of an immigrant from La Migra, the immigration authorities, and you can see just below the star-spangled cloak, right, the police car chasing the fleeing migrant. Full of layers, Lopez's imagery highlights the relationship of the past to the present, namely in the persistent haunting of contemporary geography and discourse by the racist rhetoric that was created to lead to the US-Mexican War. The lived effects of this rhetoric can be seen in the continual policing of this border, and indeed, the image argues the border doesn't exist without a constant police presence to maintain it. I'd also argue that Lopez's image invokes a sense of playfulness and irony through its placing of the manifest destiny arrow. Although manifest destiny purported to signify the inevitable spread of white settlers across the American continent, and while the arrow seemingly points to 1848 as the completion of this divine fate, the arrow more specifically draws the eye to the figure of the Virgin de Guadalupe. The Virgin of Guadalupe, a long revered figure in Chicano and Latin American culture, is on the one hand a symbol of religious conquest of Christianity across Latin America. However, I'd argue the figure is actually much more complex. As a result of cultural mixing and religious syncretism, the Virgin of Guadalupe grafts the Aztec goddess of Tonantzin onto the imposed on the figure of the Virgin Mary, creating a mestiza form of spirituality and a symbol that has come to represent freedom, resistance, and hope for the masses. A spiritual icon for Lopez, who has explored the Virgin's iconography in many of her other artworks, La Virgen not only appears at the bottom of this image, but also in the figure of Lopez's mother, whose cape that she's sewing is arguably La Virgen's cape. If the Virgin can be best understood by Lopez as embodied by the everyday struggles and lives of migrant and immigrant women, we can envision a new sort of manifest destiny in which it is the return and the spread of Chicanos and Latinos that is inevitable and not the conquest of white Americans. Just as Lopez finds the Chicana worker to be the political and spiritual heart of her imagery, printmaker and painter Esther Hernandez reclaims the undocumented and often invisible migrant woman at the heart of her 2001 portrait La Virgen de las Calles, the Virgin of the Streets. Invoking the genre of portraiture traditionally used for revered and status-holding members of society, Hernandez places the figure of the street vendor in the position of subject, emphasizing and elevating the humanity of Latina immigrants, where they are most often seen as blending into the contemporary urban landscape when they are seen at all. Like Lopez, Hernandez here sees her subject not just as an ordinary person, but as a figure of reverence, strength, and spirituality. In her portrait of the vendor, Hernandez brings an element that refers explicitly to the Virgin de Guadalupe. Like the traditional image of the Virgin, the vendor wears a rebozo of stars, that's that cloth that's draped over her head, covering her head and shoulders. She stares placidly at the viewer, invoking a feeling of peace and calm. Additionally, she sells roses, which are the traditional flower of the Virgin de Guadalupe, who is said to have established her presence and status as a saint by making roses bloom in the middle of winter. The donning of a USA sweatshirt speaks to the hybridity of migrants who are simultaneously of multiple places and cultures, both Americans and Latinos. Through her invocation of the Virgin, of course emphasized also by the work's title, the image counters stereotypes that dehumanize and degrade immigrants and street vendors alike. Hernandez rescripts the imagery and rhetoric of immigrant criminality through her portrait, replacing these stereotypes instead with a vision of hard work, dignity, and spiritual strength. Although these politics of countering xenophobic rhetorics may be more subtle in La Virgen de las Calles, Hernandez tackles discourses of criminality head-on in her print, Wanted. Created in response to Arizona's controversial SB 1070 law that required police officers to demand immigration papers from anyone suspected of being in the country illegally, which famously led to increased racial profiling and harassment of people of color, and Latinos and Chicanos especially, simply on the basis of looking like a possible immigrant. Hernandez created this image. Outraged by the rhetoric of criminality being placed on bodies of color, Hernandez uses satire to imagine the Virgin de Guadalupe herself as one of the FBI's most wanted. Here, La Virgen is clearly depicted as an indigenous woman, not glamorized or manipulated to respond to white Western notions of beauty and purity. Although the use of satire and through the use of satire and tongue-in-cheek language, Hernandez demonstrates the effects of discursive spin to paint the very elements that render the figure of the Virgin as sacred into criminalized traits. The Virgin is labeled a cult leader, human trafficker, and terrorist, and even the angel whose image typically accompanies her to demonstrate her holiness is painted as a drugged young child victim to her abuses. Her holy aura is reconfigured as a potential explosive, and the Catholicism that the Virgin represents is instead painted as a cult religion. Such hyperbolic language attached to a revered figure renders absurd the demonization of Mexican migrants. Hernandez highlights how discourse is used to frame narratives and appropriate them for racist and xenophobic purposes. The image utilizes humor to disarm viewers, even as she makes a cutting and provocative point, appropriating official U.S. law enforcement documents to demonstrate the damaging effects of such discourse. Yolanda Lopez, also a graphic artist, utilizes a combination of visual and written language to challenge discourses of illegality and authenticity. Who is the Illegal Immigrant Pilgrim was created in 1978 in response to intensifying immigration debates in the U.S., setting immigration caps for immigration from the Western Hemisphere. Politically oriented from the outset, the poster highlights the selective historical memory that paints immigrant pilgrims from Europe as authentic Americans while deeming indigenous Americans and their mestizo descendants as illegal interlopers. A furious male figure, interpreted alternatively as an Aztec warrior or an Aztec god, confronts the viewer with the irony of revisionist history that denies land ownership and citizenship claims to Chicanos and Latinos. He defiantly crumbles up immigration papers, commenting on the absurdity of the demands placed on Mexican and Latino migrants. Visually, the image alludes to the most famous graphic of Uncle Sam's Army recruitment poster. You all know the one, right? I want you for the U.S. Army, yeah? And appropriates and revisions American nationalist discourse. Lopez's cutting irony further demands an examination of the discourse of the illegal alien, turning the discourse back on those who created it. The poster also renders pilgrim as a racially and ethnically charged in radical new ways, undercutting the seemingly neutral way that white immigration is generally discussed. Lopez's work demands that we examine the origins and use of discourse and imagery together, and that we place these xenophobic imaginings squarely in the hyper-masculine and nationalist sphere from which they came. The critique inherent in the image led the poster to be replicated on t-shirts and posters used by immigration rights activists both in the 70s and 80s and even today. So for Chicanos and Latinos, art has a central place in the politics of performance and resistance, and much art is created with these political uses in mind. Contemporary poster artist Fabiana Rodriguez, there we go, is known for creating art that is political, utilitarian, and highly accessible. Rather than creating images that are meant for galleries and then using them for political ends, Rodriguez often starts from the political cause to create works that are specifically to be used by activists to usher in social change. Her butterfly image was created as part of an immigration workshop and in conversation with activists in 2012. This is the image smack in the middle there. The image welcoming dreamers, designed specifically to lobby for the passage of the DREAM Act, is just one of many versions of her Migration is Beautiful butterfly, which has become synonymous with the pro-immigration side of debates on immigration reform. The monarch butterfly, which makes its annual pilgrimage across the US-Mexican border, paints migration as natural, beautiful, and outside the jurisdiction of legal systems. Just as one wouldn't attempt to keep butterflies from following their natural migration patterns, so too should we vision human beings as part of an ecosystem that values freedom of movement. Rodriguez has not only created a specific work of art, but she's created a new visual vocabulary that intervenes in the criminalizing discourse of immigration and border control. The image has been taken up by activists at all levels, from grassroots to national organizations. And you can see other activists using that butterfly image in their protests at the bottom right of the slideshow. Rodriguez's visual cultural interventions put a human face on migration issues, document grassroots movements through portraiture of both real and fictitious activists, and center female leadership and activism. Unflinchingly feminist in her politics, Rodriguez directly links women's liberation to all of the political causes she creates imagery for, as can be seen in the second image. Her human figures highlight diversity and emphasize the beauty of indigenous characteristics, where normally those are characteristics that are seen as less than. So one last artist to look at. While considering Rodriguez's work has allowed us to delve into the deliberately activist, on-the-street use of art and visual culture, the last artist I want to turn our attention to returns us back to the gallery tradition from which we began. Consuelo Jimenez Underwood is a mixed media artist who utilizes textiles and feminized indigenous art practices such as weaving and sewing to interrogate the politics of the US-Mexican border and immigration policies. While I could show you any number of images from decades of art production, today I'd like to talk about a piece from her Borderline series. This is called Undocumented Border Flowers. Immediately, the title plays with humor and irony, centering the earth and the environment as having a complete, distinct relationship that renders the border both fictional and capricious. As Underwood writes of this piece, and I quote her, "The California poppy, the Arizona saguaro, New Mexico yucca, and the Texas bluebonnet grow on both sides of the border. Will they require documentation as well? How? Yikes," end quote. Like Rodriguez, she sees nature as offering a foil to dehumanizing and criminalizing discourse surrounding immigration. Using large-scale images created out of found objects and textiles, Underwood depicts the border as an angry red line, one that is man-made and imposed on a natural landscape. Wildflowers grow rebelliously on both sides of the borderline, challenging the legitimacy of the border itself. To the side of the borderline, found objects spell out the names of cities on both sides of the border, intermingled with one another. Underwood combines a concern with the environmental impacts of the border, as well as instigating discussion about border politics. The piece disobeys even the borders of the space itself, bleeding onto the floor, placing textile together with paint and other visual art components, showing the beauty that emerges from challenging stark divisions and separations. So the work of artists I've shown you today responds directly to politically charged rhetoric surrounding the border, from immigration debates to controversial laws. They place migrant women and the experiences of the borderlands at the center of the debates and imagine creative ways to enter into the conversation, looking to highlight humanity, dignity, creativity, spirituality, and ethical responsibility, both to the earth and to one another as human beings, into our discourse. This intervenes in racist and xenophobic thinking, pointing out how these issues have shaped our actions as a nation, and demanding that we come up with new language, both verbal and visual, to combat these very real struggles for our contemporary era. The voices of Chicana artists are crucial to considering these debates and how to combat harmful rhetorics and practices, yet they're largely missing from the national conversation around the DACA appeal. I challenge us as we celebrate Hispanic Heritage this month to bring them back into the picture as crucial voices in the debates surrounding creating sustainable, compassionate, and creative immigration policies. Thank you. I know that we started a little bit late. I believe we have until 1:45, which gives us just a few minutes for questions or comments. So if anyone would like to chime into a conversation, I certainly welcome thoughts. Yeah.
I was just wondering what happens if you do get deported. What's the process like? Because like, if you try to imagine it, just picture someone just alone in the middle of an empty desert. What actually happens?
I mean, I think it depends a lot on each individual person, right? So some folks who are deported may have family in Mexico, some may not. Some may have never set foot in Mexico or other countries that they're being returned to, or have any facility in Spanish language, right? And so I think the experience can be very different depending on what one's own circumstances are. Certainly there are processes for appealing these decisions, but they certainly are also costly. They are determined by access to lawyers, immigration officials, and so they're not equal access to everyone. Right? So I wish there was a really concrete answer of what specifically happens, but again, it's very different depending on one's individual circumstances. Yeah.
Obviously, things are looking bleak in terms of immigration prospects in the Trump sort of years, and we could be looking at an 8-year entrenchment of this policy. But given the cyclical nature, the way you contextualize this at the beginning, that it's all kind of economically driven to some extent, if Trump succeeds in expanding the economy in the manner that he intends, do you think that we could kind of cycle around? And I mean, obviously, especially this made in America kind of mentality, we're going to need some significant labor, as we had during the Second World War and other moments in our history. Do you think we could get to that point eventually, or do you think the kind of racist, xenophobic attitude is so deeply established and growing that even if, given an economic upswing notwithstanding, this might not happen?
I mean, I had the same questions as I was looking at this history, right? So as the U.S. kind of increases its discourse about rhetorics of war, right? Are we thinking about a time when we might have similar kind of demands to that period of time? I think it's possible. I also think, though, that we're in a slightly different place and that we have a much higher standing population of Hispanic folks already in the United States. And that has already kind of set the stage for some of this rhetoric that has happened, and I think it's played into the fears of many folks who support the repeal of DACA. And so whether or not we can get beyond that, I think is an important question. And also I think that our demographics have shifted a whole lot too. I think that we have many, many more people of mixed races of all sorts of combinations, and that changes, and that upcoming generations, through which we are a much more diverse population, I think must inevitably shape the way that our politics play out in the future, even if it's not so immediate right now, right? So I guess I do hold out some hope, although I agree the situation right now is pretty bleak and it doesn't show signs of turning around immediately. But the cyclical nature of history, I guess, always gives me some amount of hope that even as we swing from one side to another in terms of these debates, that we are in the middle of a swing. At least that's the optimistic side of me.
You mentioned the military dimension here, which is another interesting dimension, because I think a lot of Americans don't realize the number of Hispanics that serve in America's armed forces.
Absolutely.
And if our role continues to grow, which it appears it will, in terms of potential military conflicts, then there might be an insatiable need there as well. And
the military has been used historically as a way to grant citizenship to migrants into the United States, right? Historically, we have a long precedent of that. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not those are the kinds of those kind of policies get maintained. Like, what's the higher national interest here? And I think we kind of have yet to see how that will play out, but I think it will be an interesting thing to keep an eye on for sure.
Is there a reason, like, our President Trump and the Mexican president can't, like, strike up a deal where we can just buy Mexico, and then the immigration question is no longer
I think it's an interesting question, right? If some of the land that is now in the U.S. used to be Mexico, right? What's to say that it can't be that again, or that we couldn't think about combining our resources in a different way? I mean, I think that we are pretty entrenched in the idea of a United States that is separate from Mexico, and I don't necessarily see any kind of political support that would advocate for that on a large scale. But I do think that it's a question that has driven a lot of activism, right? A lot of Chicano and Latino activists have consistently said, right, this the area that I showed you in the map that was taken over by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right, should that not belong to Mexican Americans historically? What would happen if they were to reclaim that? Oftentimes this is meant metaphorically rather than literally, but certainly there are contingents of the population who believe that this should be a literal return. Yeah, and our demographics certainly support the case that we may, once again, be at a time where folks of Hispanic heritage might be the majority population in these places, which could conceivably shape the way politics work. Again, I don't necessarily see, I don't see a way forward that would combine both of these places, but I think that theoretically it's an interesting question and one that has driven a lot of kind of activism and creative thinking around the border. Yeah.
I like that image of the monarch butterfly as a migrant, which we readily accept, and we could also see hummingbirds, same way.
Yeah.
You know, we accept this kind of, why are we so resistant to human migration, which has been always happening.
Yeah, I agree. I think nature is such a powerful metaphor for thinking about just the naturalness of moving around. And when you think about families that literally, you know, one day there's no war, the next day there's a war, suddenly you're on one side of the border from your family, how do you make a decision like that? You know, these are decisions that we don't impose on the natural world, at least not theoretically, right? So how do we think about using nature as a guide for more compassionate policies and more compassionate ways to think about the border? Yeah, I agree.
And life.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I thank you so much for your questions and comments and for being here today. Thank you.